Welcome. Uh, Again, we are GE3108, Investigating Language and Art, Invention, Inspiration. Welcome back to those of you that were here last week. And welcome to those who are here for the first time. I'm going to begin with just a brief uh, review of some of the points that were made last time and a few brief introductory remarks about the course. And first thing is about assessment. And remind you that there will be 4 aspects to the assessment. Continuous participation tasks. Now, those will be a question that will be asked, and you'll be asked to write around 150, 200 words on responding to that question. And here is a schedule for those continuous participation tasks. You'll notice the first one will come next week, week 3, and it'll be due on the 5th of February. That'll be a Friday. And then subsequently, week 5, week 9, week 11. Now, this is a good way to get 20% really rather easily. It simply entails responding and submitting your written, again, 150, 200 words response to a question that I will give you. And the first one will be next week. And the questions are all related to the lecture and what I've been covering. So it won't entail research on your part, or it will really just be responding to on the basis and just sort of keep you on track throughout the semester. So that's the continuous participation task. And there will be 4, and each of them is worth 5 marks. And you, again, as I say, can quite easily accumulate 20 marks, 20% of your grade. Now, in addition to that, you will have an open book midterm test, and this will be in sort of the middle midterm. It's a midterm test. And again, as I've mentioned to you before, on Canvas in the files under week 1, I put one document that gives past questions that I've used for the midterm and for the final exam. Give you an idea what kinds of questions I might be asking. It'll be along, it won't be the same questions, of course, but it'll be along similar lines. And these are open book, meaning you have access to anything and everything while you're doing your writing, your answer. It can be, of course, because we're online, so it can be, you can be using your computer you can be Googling and finding out information. But the best thing of all is that you are coming prepared and know something of the topic that you are going to probably be asked about. And a term paper. The term paper will be, that counts 20%. And again, that usually for the term paper, what I do is I ask students to identify, select an example of some use of language. It could be a poem, it can be a song, it can be a drama that for you impresses you that this is art, invention, or inspiration. But I will make one requirement for this, that I want you to also, in addition to it just not just being your own response to this piece, I want you to research and find out how other people responded, how other people talk about that poem, that song, that drama, that use of language. More about that later on in the semester, but just to give you an idea what is expected and so forth. And finally, the final exam counts 40%. And again, this is open book, similar to the midterm. All right, so let's carry on. Again, I've gone through this. This is the continuous participation task. So wash out week 3. That will be the first assignment. And you have to submit by that due date. All right. All right, so quickly, what I'd like to do today, I'd like to review somewhat what we covered last week. Again, I urge you to go online and Canvas, and in the announcements, I give the link to the video, and I put the video up on YouTube uh, and on my channel on YouTube, and you can go back and look at last week's lecture. Each week I'll do that, and you can review it. For those of you that are new this week that weren't here last week, you can go back and you can listen to it and have a good idea what we covered. But just to sort of lay the groundwork for what we will cover today, I will just go over briefly some of those uh, topics that we covered. And today we will go on to verbal art. Verbal art, what's that? That's, well, verbal, it's language, and it's art. So where is the art in the use of language? Going to be looking at some examples, and we're not going to cover all that you see here today. We'll be taking a look at Ruqayya Hassan. This is a famous linguist, and her view on how language is turned into art. And we'll take a look at some examples of poetry. Uh, Today, I hope I'll be able to begin at least to talk about some examples from a Singaporean poet. He's known as the father of English language poetry in Singapore. His name is Edwin Tumbu, and I've looked at his poetry, and there's some really interesting things to observe about his poetry. I don't think we'll get to today the drama in film, Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. I'm expecting we'll get to that next time. Okay, so last time we began on this topic of what is metaphor. And if you see me looking over to my side here occasionally as I'm going through this, this is because I have another computer here that allows me then to see what you are seeing. And I also use that to have the chat window on it. So as I'm going through, if there's any problems with the videos, any problem with what you're seeing on the screen, any problem with hearing me well enough, uh, do let me know. All right? Okay, back to the topic. What is a metaphor? I hope this is quite clear in terms of what we talked about last time. What is a metaphor? What is its purpose? To picture that which cannot be seen, or to say, so as to say what otherwise cannot be said. And again, I refer you to this book, and I heartily recommend it. It's not a required reading for the course, but it is a very interesting book that if this topic at all interests you and you're interested in poetry and the making of mind. This is written not by a linguist. Remember, I introduced him last week. He's emeritus professor of psychiatry at the University of Sydney, Russell Mears. And he has done a lot of work in terms of counseling and so forth, but he sees a role for poetry in healing. And I strongly recommend it to you. I found it quite inspirational myself. So metaphor is important. Function is to picture. It is a picture making function. That is what is a metaphor. Metaphor is a picture. What otherwise cannot be said. Now, we need to distinguish what we typically think of as metaphor. And what we typically, traditionally, whenever you say metaphor, people think in terms of lexical metaphors, words as metaphors. So in the example I gave, Tim is a rock. You're meant to picture. In English, as I mentioned, English, when I say someone is a rock, it means to give someone the quality of rockness, firmness, strength, solid, like that. Okay? But that is a lexical metaphor. But last week we went on to say that there's also, now you have lexical metaphors, but you also have something we call a grammatical metaphor. Grammatical metaphor. Now, what is that? Well, go back and think about the fact that when we usually talk about the world around us, when we talk about something, we use nouns. When we talk about actions, happenings, we talk about them in terms of verbs. We use verbs. You see the list here: qualities, adjectives, processes, verbs, circumstances, adverbs, prepositional phrases. If it's a relator word, conjunctions. Okay, so that's what we sort of, now Halliday, now if you remember from last week, this linguist is M.A.K. Halliday, and I follow that sort of school of linguistics that he has put forward called systemic functional linguistics. So I refer to his work quite a bit. I am also the director of the Halliday Center here at City University, and I'm the editor of Halliday's collected works, 11 volumes. So I'm very familiar with his work, and so you will hear me refer to him from time to time. Now, Halliday talks about this, the idea that things are nouns and processes are verbs and qualities are adjectives as a relation of congruence. It's congruent. It is sort of the default, sort of the straightforward way in which we typically experience the world. So let's see it as sort of like that there is one level is meaning and another level is grammar, and we can use another word to describe that, wording. Right? So we have semantics, meaning, grammar, wording, and they are sort of connected up with each other. Things are nouns, relators are conjunctions, processes are verbs. And that's sort of the congruent coupling between meaning and wording. Now, what we said last week was you can decouple that connection, reconnect it, reconstrue how you see the world, so that instead of seeing a process, a happening, as necessarily being a verb, turn it into a noun. But when you do so, what happens is that it acquires the sort of properties of nouns, nounness. The example I gave was remind is a verb, to remind someone of something. Add to it the qualities of nounness, we get reminder. And reminder becomes something. The happening becomes a something. And I refer to an example from a speech given by Donald Jung. Again, you can go back and listen to that. I won't replay that today. And he compares two things. At one level, this, and another level, that. And at one level, he says, you can read. Now, can, possibility. So he qualifies it with a modal auxiliary, can. It's possible, what? To read, to And by this, he's not meaning the activity of reading, he's meaning to understand. So it's rather mentally, there's a possibility that you can understand it this way. But at another level, it is a reminder. He doesn't say at another level, it reminds us, which would be then a verb that again deals with memory and the mind. No, instead he turns that verb remind into a reminder. It becomes something, and he uses the verb to be. It's something that exists. It is a reminder. So it takes on qualities of a noun, which are what? What are the qualities of nouns? They are things. They have a sense of substance to them. They're, they're static. So in reconstruing this sentence, instead of saying it reminds us, by changing it to it is a reminder, he is employing grammatical metaphor. Now, I last time talked about how grammatical metaphor and the ability to create metaphor, whether it be lexical or grammatical, two different perspectives on how we come to have this ability, which most describe as uniquely human, the ability to metaphorize, whether in word or in grammar. And there were two perspectives that I talked about. One was Russell Mears, comes at it from the view of psychiatry and his experience as a psychiatrist. And he sees the way we look at the world as the way we develop this, the way a child develops it, is a kind of pattern matching. We compare like with like. We make replicas or we make analogs, something that resembles, but we're always comparing like with like. But then metaphor is that sort of turn in a different direction where we're not comparing like with like, but like with unlike. Tin is a rock, like with unlike. So we, as he says, paradoxically, we perceive similarity in something that is really completely dissimilar. Halliday, on the other hand, doesn't talk about it in terms of a direction of pattern matching and then a step aside to comparing like with unlike. No, he talks about it as we are moving in a direction of abstractness. We generalize, and we create abstract notions, and then again a step aside to metaphor. Because now, why is it a step aside? Because in fact, our abstracting, when we turn everything into nouns, it does seem to be like it's also in a kind of abstraction, but in a way, what we do is our abstracting ends up making everything more concrete. That is paradoxical. The more abstract we become in our theorizing and how we see the world, the more concrete the world becomes. It becomes a world of things. This is paradoxical. That's probably the best way to describe. What is metaphor? Metaphor is the paradoxical. And why we do it? Well, by exploring the adjacent possible, by seeing what options we have other than the expected, we are enlarging the meaning space within which we can now operate. We aren't fixed. It isn't fixed that a happening must be described as in terms of a verb. No, we can describe it as a noun, and then it takes on certain other properties. But as Halliday points out, in that respect, our abstracting ends up making us even see the world in more concrete terms. And this is especially noticeable in science, the language of science. The need to give what we are studying a sense of sort of fixed, it's sort of static. It allows us to measure it, it allows us to observe it. It gives us control. Why is it control? Because we are able to look at, we are able to turn a dynamic happening into a static something. And by making it fixed, we are able to measure it. We are able to study it. So now, what has evolved in the language of science, in the way we write, and I don't by this mean just uh, biology and chemistry and so forth. This is now the way we write at the level of at the university in an academic setting. Our language is highly nominalized, turned into nouns. And so what has evolved for the language of science, and by that I mean really much academic use, but again, that filters into the language of how the bureaucracy, administrators, how they write. Again, a highly nominalized way of expressing how we see the world. And what has resulted in is a special register, a special way of using language to talk about the world. That's why when you come into university, well, you'll encounter it already in secondary school. As you're writing, you're learning that the way you talked at home, the way you talked as a child, doesn't quite belong in a university setting. You have to learn to express yourself in a different way. Instead of the more verbal, you become more highly nominalized. So instead of saying they educated girls and then women acquired the vote, which is all fine, it's all grammatical. You got a clause, they educated girls, you got a verb, educated, and a conjunction as a relator, and then another clause, women acquired the vote, another verb. But you'll notice that a lot when you're reading, when you're writing in a university setting, for example, it turns into, instead of the educated girls, it becomes the education of girls. And instead of women acquired the vote, you have the acquisition of the vote by women. These are nominal groups. They are, some would say, noun phrases. They're nouns. They're things. The education of girls, the acquisition of the vote by women. You've got two nouns now. Now, how are you going to relate them? You can't use a conjunction because conjunction is used to join clauses and then. But how do you show the relationship between these two events? You use a verb. And so, in fact, this whole sort of highly nominalized way of speaking has involved several changes. Verbs and adjectives are shifted to nouns. Conjunctions are shifted to verbs. And a sentence with two clauses, we call it a clause complex, becomes one simple clause. The education of girls preceded the acquisition of the vote by women. It's one simple clause. Grammatically simple. But then what is the complication? Why do we think that, oh, then language of science and writing in the university is more complicated? No, the complication is not in the grammar. You notice where is the complication? In the lexical, the word density. You have the education of girls. You have the acquisition of the vote by women. All of that, these are packed into nouns. They're all packed together. And so you have a high lexical density, but really grammatically even more simple. And what were clauses before have just become nominal groups, phrases. But this is not the end of the story. We said that this ability to turn to create metaphors is the really a step in a direction of being able to create our myth. What is a myth? Myth is a story that has some elements of which require pictures to understand it, that cannot be completely articulated. A theory, basically. And what is a theory? A theory is a myth. Russell Mears says this: the main implication of these ideas is that the evolutionary trajectory of Homo sapiens was towards the ability to construct a story, the prologue to which is necessarily a proto-language and involves the use of symbols, metaphor. Metaphor as the basis for being able to create a story. He continues, the crucial narrative which Homo sapiens evolved that gave it an evolutional advantage was not any kind of story. It had the structure of myth, depending on the coordination of these two forms of language, two modes of thought. What he's saying is that what we see in terms of myth, story, is really bringing together two, as he puts it, two forms of language, two modes of thought. What are these complementary modes of thought? One is a sort of inner speech, which, and you can see the qualities that are mentioned there. The other is a speech for speaking to others, social speech. And these correspond to the hemispheres of the brain. As is mentioned here, in the inner speech, right hemispheric, social speech, left hemispheric. This, by the way, comes from, again, Russell Mears, but a different book. It is his clinician's manual, because, as I mentioned, he's a psychiatrist. He deals with people with borderline personality disorder. And the method that he then uses as a way to deal with those that have borderline personality disorder is what he calls the conversational model. Use of language as a way to bring healing, to bring together this inner speech and this outer speech. So when we theorize and when we create our theories, these theories are basically the myths that we create and founded on the basis that we have this metaphor making ability. Every theory is a myth about that which it is theorizing. So where does the creativity come in language? Can we sort of quantify it? Can we sort of predict it? No. What we see in grammar, the abilities that we have in language, these enable creativity, but we can never really predict. Just like, and the The example that I gave last time, which comes from Stuart Kaufman, if you'll remember, and that is from biology, what he called Darwinian pre-adaptations, and a ceaseless creativity. That's the basis. What we're trying to get at then here is, what is the basis for creativity that is infinite, that is ceaseless? We cannot predict the direction that it will go, but we have some way to understand how it came about. Now, as I mentioned last time, how I approach it, I'm a linguist. I study language. So what I'm trying to find is a theory, a method of doing linguistics that I can use to help me take a look at a text and understand that text. Understand it, not just at one level, but to take a poem and to find out, why is it art? Where's the art in verbal art? Halliday says this: what is important is that we should be able to, and to be able to use the same theory and method of linguistic analysis, the same, he doesn't call it linguistics, he calls it grammatics, because for him, it's all about the ways in which we realize meaning, and that is what he means by grammar. What is important is that we should be able to use the same theory and method of linguistic analysis, the same grammatics, whatever kind of text or subtext we're trying to interpret. Tennyson, Darwin, Mother Goose, or the Scientific American. We should be able to, our linguistics should be such that we can apply it to any kind of text. And as he goes on to say, otherwise, unless we have a real methodology, if we simply approach each text with an ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit or private commentary, well, that's what we don't want to get into in this course. We don't want it to be that here is a speech, it's eloquent, dynamic, and my own sort of private way of expressing my views about this text. That's not interesting, is it? Rather, we want a way to be able to explain the similarities and differences. We want to be able to explain the aesthetic, where is the beauty, where is the eloquence, and the functional values. What is the purpose to which this text is being put, that differentiate one text from another, or one voice from another within the frontiers of the same text. Now, that is how we're going to try to approach it. And that's why we rely on linguistics, the study of language, the study of the resources that are available that give us this power to make metaphors in language. So, Halliday describes a language as being more than a semiotic system. Not just any semiotic system, because we have meaning all around us, right? It is a system that makes meanings, a semogenic system. It makes meanings. How does it make meaning? How do you make meaning? Because you make choices, and those choices are the basis for how you were going to mean what you say. To go back to that speech, Donald Trump had a choice. It reminds us, or it is a reminder. He had a choice. And by choosing one of these, he was making meaning. And so when we talk about meaning, we talk about it in terms of not just typically what we think of when we think of meaning. If I say, what's the meaning? You think, okay, I go get a dictionary and I look it up and I find out the meaning. No. Where we're talking about is meaning in a bit more broader sense than that. We talked about the meta functions, the experiential, how we reflect on the world, how we construe the world, how we expand on our ideas, the logical, the interpersonal, how we use language to create a relationship, how we take our ideas and our interpersonal relations and how we bring those out, we materialize them, we turn them into the text, and that is the final aspect of the meaning. The ideational, the interpersonal, textual. Now, what enables this, Halliday says, is the lexicogrammar, the wording, the meaning is invisible, right? You can't see meaning. What you can see is the wording. So Halliday says, thinking about meaning, trying to get at the meaning, means thinking grammatically. What does it mean, thinking grammatically? It means, like, again, I'll go back to that example. We talked about Donald Jung. It was taking a verb and turning it into a noun that gave became reminder, which gave it a kind of substance, which gave it a sense of being existing. But it's the grammar that did that. It's the choice that Donald Jung had in that case to be able to choose as a verb or as a noun. The choice, though, came down to the grammar. So when we are talking about meaning, we're talking about wording. We talk about how we experience the world. It comes down to a process, participants, circumstances. Very simply, it becomes the kinds of process. We represent it typically as a verb. What's happening? Who is involved? Who initiated the process? Who is affected by it? What are the circumstances related to it? That's how we sort of see the world. We see it in terms of verbs, processes, and participants, nouns, and perhaps prepositional phrases, adverbials that describe the circumstances. The logical. How are the clauses combined? Because we don't just, we take an utterance, a clause, consisting of a process and participants and maybe circumstances, and we expand on that with clause after clause after clause, and that produces the text. Now, how are those clauses then related one to the other? Logically, is it a sequence where it is quite symmetrical, or is one clause more dependent on another one? Interpersonal meaning. What is my relationship with you? If I'm making a statement, I'm giving you information. You are the recipient. But if I ask you a question, I want to be the recipient and I want you to give me. If I make an imperative, open the door, I'm telling you to do something. Again, it's my relationships, and if I'm giving or receiving, this is indicated by the grammar. Even how we create that coherent text is going to be also involving choices about, you make a choice about how you begin each clause. every clause, how does it begin? Is there a choice? Yes, there's a choice. If I'm making a statement, typically it's the grammatical subject, but it need not be the grammatical subject. But the fact that I don't use the grammatical subject in the sense of, I read a book. How did I begin that? I. Well, I is it's the grammatical subject, and it is a statement. That's sort of the default way of doing it. A book was read by me. Now I put a book to begin with. I can make choices about what I put first. All right, so this is the challenge here. By thinking grammatically, how much can one learn about how a text comes to mean what it does? By the way that we're going to be looking at it, language here, by thinking grammatically, how much can we learn about how a text comes to mean what it does? That's the challenge. Yeah, I'm proposing, following Halliday, that we're going to, in trying to think about meaning, we're going to think grammatically. You remember that Russell Mears, and he says the words of a poem are used in a symbolic way, having more than a single meaning. And then he goes on to say this: the effect of a few simple words combined in a particular way is to evoke a sense of reality that none of them possess alone. The nature of this reality is not precise, it is indefinite. Critically, what I'm talking about here, the effect of a few simple words. Yes, the words are used in a symbolic way. Yes, the words have more than one meaning, but what we're talking about is the effect of a few simple words combined in a particular way. Now, what is that? That's the wording. The wording. Not just words, but the combination of words. And when we talk about the combination of words, we're talking about the grammar. It's not just about the words, it's also about the wordings. One of the volumes in the collected works is a volume related to studies of text and discourse. And in that volume of writings of M.A.K. Halliday, there's a chapter on Tennyson's In Memoriam, poem In Memoriam. I'm not going to go into that today. The title of Halliday's talk was Poetry as Scientific Discourse, the nuclear sections of Tennyson's In Memoriam. But in that chapter, Halliday makes a comment. He says this, because he's talking about a particular passage within that poem, all right? And he says this: the grammar of this passage is that of spoken rather than of written language. Now that's something, all right? They're different. How we speak, how we write. But this is a poem. But it is in a way sort of created in such a way that it comes across as like spoken rather than like written language. Halliday continues, this is seen most clearly in the clause complexes, also in the transitivity patterns where there's little nominalization or other grammatical metaphor, and much of the lexical content is in the verbs. And he continues, there is an excellent discussion of this in a little paper by Walker Gibson, written in 1958, in the course of which he remarks, this is the quote I'm after, all right? I submit then that Tennyson's poetic imagination can sometimes be examined in terms of his grammar. You see, grammar is giving us insight. And what we mean by grammar, we mean the wording, the combination of words, how they're combined, to express the way we experience the world, how they are combined to express our relationships, how they are combined to express what we want to talk about, and how we've organized the text into a coherent text. We're going to start to take a look at verbal art. And how I'm going to be looking at this is through a particular linguistic scholar. Her name is Ruqaiya Hasan, and you can see the book there, Linguistics, Language, and Verbal Art. Now, she's written many books and many journal papers and so forth on this topic and other topics in linguistics. But you see, this book influenced me a lot. I must admit that when I was younger, I didn't really like poetry. I really didn't see the point of it. You can say I didn't understand it. And my linguistics, I didn't at all apply to verbal art and so forth like that. That was not a direction I was interested in. Then I was reading her book here, Linguistics, Language, and Verbal Art. There was one chapter in particular that really impressed me, really influenced me, because what I could see was that I can see why it's art. What are the resources in language? How are they being used to create art? I could begin to see the craft behind the art. And that impressed me. That showed me that it's not just putting words down. There is a particular craft. There is a way in which the artist, say it's a poet, the dramatist, there is a craft by which they take the resources that are there in language. And it's not just the words, it's in the wordings, it's in the combination of words, it's in the grammar. Now let me go through and, well, it's around 12:48 now, and I think rather than start this and then take a break, it would make more sense to take the break here. It's 12:48, close to 10 to the hour. So let's take a break, and just to make it round out, we'll just say at the top of the hour. All right, at 1 o'clock, we'll come back and we'll resume. All right. So I haven't seen anything on chat that makes me think that you aren't seeing and hearing me. All right. So I assume that is going fine. So let's take a break now. Okay. See you at the top of the hour at 1 o'clock. Okay. Okay. And we're back. And Can you see the results of the poll? Uh, can you see them? Okay, great. So let's just take a look and see. Do you like poetry? Well, we haven't heard from all of you. But of those that we've heard, the poll, 36 of you at least responded. Thank you for responding. Half of you said yes. A few of you no, and quite a few of you no opinion about poetry. Okay, so you're on the fence as far as poetry, but most of you indicate that you've been moved, you've been inspired by a poem. So that should be that's quite significant, because then if you've been inspired by a poem, you do see something of the value of poetry. Have you ever written poetry? A few of you have. That's good. Most of you haven't. Uh, well, at least what I'm glad to see is that there's quite a few of you that you've been inspired by poetry. Some of you, half of you that responded at least, indicated that you like poetry. So let's try to convince those who are sitting on the fence or who are not really so sure about poetry. Let's see if we can inspire them. All right. So let's come back to our looking at this answer and trying to answer this question about where is the art in verbal art. Okay, first thing. One of the things that Professor Hassan pointed out was that we have to realize that there's two orders of meaning. On the one hand, and that's what you see on your screen, you have what's called the verbalization. What's the verbalization? That's just use of language. That's just you pick up the newspaper and it has meaning. It involves grammar. Maybe it's you listen to it. It has phonology, so it has all the elements of language. It just that is the word spoken, the word written. Okay, and it's just understood on the surface. That's how you understand it. But what she's suggesting is that there is another deeper meaning to be found. Now, how is this deeper meaning realized? She puts it like this. She calls it symbolic articulation, where the meanings of language are turned into signs having a deeper meaning. Where the meanings of language are turned into signs having a deeper meaning. Symbolic articulation. Typical of academic discourse, it is highly nominalized, all right? So unpack it. What is symbolic articulation? It's articulating symbols. Symbols are what? Metaphors. So it's really it is this metaphor making potential that she's talking about. She calls it symbolic articulation. How is it achieved? How do you articulate the symbols? How do you create the metaphors? She talks about it as being a kind of foregrounding. Now, you know what I mean when I say the background. And if you take a look at the picture that's on your screen, what do you see? You see lots of trees, right? And so primarily what you see in that box is a lot of trees. It's green. But then if you look at it, you see that there's sort of this, it almost looks like a white line. We assume probably that it's a waterfall. And it stands out because against a background where it's all the same green, you have this sort of white line that's coming down the middle of it. And that white line, that waterfall, is foregrounded. It's brought to the fore. And you only can really bring something to the fore, to the front, if you have a background. So what's the background? Well, there, yeah, it's all the trees. But when we're talking about language, now what's the background? Now that's why you see on your screen, mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency. Mobilizing, taking, using the habitual patterns, the way you typically use language, I'm going, using the verb ing, you're using that to indicate that it's a sort of continuous kind of process, right? So that's a choice that you're making, but taking those, just the ways we use language, just taking the grammar as it is and giving it a non-habitual, meaning it stands out, it's obvious, it has a regularity, it has a consistency that isn't typical. It stands out. In other words, what is mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency? Is creating the background. Now, why do you do this? Why do you create a background against which you're going to foreground? You do it in order to create, now, Hassan calls it theme. Now, it's a bit, because the term theme is also used by Halliday, but in a very different sense. He's talking about it from a linguistic point of view, what occurs first within a clause. But here, Hassan, when she uses the word theme, she's using it like in literature. The theme, the motif, the idea, or as she puts it, this, a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. A hypothesis, a theory, the myth, all right? A hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. Turning those metaphors, articulating those symbols to create that story, to create that myth, to create that hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. There is a function, there is a purpose, there is an art. Now, Hassan goes on to say this. She says this, what she's just been describing, all right, does not necessarily mean that theme is what initially engages the reader. In other words, you read that poem or you see that drama, and it may not communicate to you right away it may not engage with you that you see this hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. But what she's saying is this, and now here's the art. Theme is what stays in the reader's consciousness long after the pleasure of encountering the artistic turn of phrases has dissipated itself, long after you've forgotten the wording, long after you've forgotten the words and how they're used. What will stick in your mind, what will stay with you, is this theme. And it may not be what immediately you read, it may not be what you immediately see, but it's something that's going to stick with you, going to enter your consciousness, and it's going to be something that maybe you didn't realize as you were reading it, but the message is going to come through. So the theme is a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. In other words, something about life, a meaning, a message. The artist doesn't just, it's not just pure aesthetic. It may be, but to be truly art, it has to have both the aesthetic and the functional. Remember what Mears was saying about how we have sort of this complementarity between inner speech and outer speech? This complementarity, two forms of language, two forms of thought. The one is the aesthetic, the other is the functional. And when that comes together in a poem or a drama or some other expression of verbal art, there is a message. There's a message that the writer is conveying. She continues, Ruqaiya Hasan, the patterns of language are so deployed as to take us in a particular direction. Each message, think of messages like a clause. Each clause is a clause or a message by itself. But the totality of these clauses, the totality of these messages enunciates a theme. The theme becomes accessible by examination of the individual messages, guided by the repatterning of patterns. Repatterning of patterns. In other words, what the artist does is create a background, mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice in a non-habitual consistency. Creating that background, creating those patterns that provide the background, and then breaking the pattern. Breaking the pattern. That's what foregrounding is. A repatterning. And in that repatterning, drawing you in a direction, taking you in a direction, drawing your attention to this message, this overall message, this theme, this hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. Now that I find fascinating then, to take a look at a poem with that in mind. What is the poet telling me? What is the poet getting across to me through the use of language, such that that literary artifact, that poem, that drama, whatever, is an extended metaphor. An extended metaphor, essentially the artist's myth come through in that piece of language. Now, Halliday, by the way, Halliday and Hasan both have passed away quite recently. Both were husband and wife. Both world-renowned linguists in their own right, okay? I did the collected works of Professor Halliday. I also done the collected works of Ruqaiya Hasan. Come back to this point. Halliday uses a word here. He doesn't call it foregrounding. In fact, he wants to use a term It's called de-automatization. It sounds like a big chunk, big word, all right? Again, a big nominalization, de-automatization. But it is a significant idea. He prefers this term. The term came from what was called a Prague school linguist. There was a school of linguistics called the Prague School. And they did a lot of work with respect to verbal art and language. Very functional kind of linguistics. Halliday prefers Mukarovsky's term de-automatization to foregrounding. Halliday prefers that term to what Hassan's been calling foregrounding. Since, as he continues, what is in question is not simply prominence. It's not simply that white line, that waterfall against a background of trees, but rather the partial freeing of the lower level systems from the control of the semantics so that they become domains of choice in their own right. Now, I know we need to unpack that. I want you to think back to, remember I showed you before, you had a layer, it was called semantics, right? And you have another layer which was called the grammar, or the lexicogrammar, or the wording. You have meaning, we have the wording, remember? And what we're saying is that the meaning and the semantics and the connection with the lower level, the grammar. Remember we said they were like coupled together, so you had things are nouns and so on and so forth, right? Halliday is saying it's really what's taking place here is a kind of foregrounding, is a kind of de-automatization. You are freeing up that linkage. Now, we said that when you did that, for example, when you decoupled and you said the process could be expressed as a verb. I'm sorry, the process can be expressed as a noun. That is a decoupling. You're taking away that linkage between semantics and grammar. You're breaking that connection, and you're redefining, recoupling it in a different way. Now, what Halliday is saying is de-automatization is that act of freeing the semantics and the systems underneath it. In other words, the grammar, so that the grammar is now no longer bound to semantics, bound to meaning, and they can become, the choices can be made in their own right. You can make other choices. To de-automatize, Halliday says this. It's on the screen here. To de-automatize means to try to interpret the grammar in terms that go beyond its direct realizational function. To interpret the grammar in terms that go beyond its direct realizational function. Let's see what that means. What is de-automatize? First of all, when we've been talking about foregrounding, we said it takes place against a background. What is the background? The background is the automatization. The writer creates a default. The writer creates an automatic. In that picture, it was the automatic were the trees. And then the writer artistically does this with language, creates a default, taking the habitual patterns of grammatical choice, taking them and putting them into a non-habitual consistency, a regularity which isn't usual in language, and then is defining and prominent within this particular text, creating that automatization. Why? against which to de-automatize. You see, de-automatization explains foregrounding, but it also explains grammatical metaphor. And so grammatical metaphor, which is the basis for innovation in language, and foregrounding, which is the basis for creativity in language, art, really are the same thing. In which there is, for the artist, it is creating an automatization against which to de-automatize. In other words, creating a pattern in order to break the pattern. That's it. So that's what an artist is doing. An artist is deliberately creating a pattern against which then there will be a breaking of that pattern, a repatterning. In other words, to draw your attention to a particular idea that you might not grasp the first time you read it, but it will be, Hassan suggests, something that will stick with you. Now, question can be asked, and the question is this: how can you distinguish between artistically intentional acts of de-automatization or foregrounding? You got it? When is it art? And when is it just a sort of, I mean, you can statistically say that, yes, there's a certain consistency to the use of language here, but it has nothing to do with the artist's intention as far as creating a background against which to foreground. How do you distinguish when it is intentional artistic craft as opposed to accidentally happening that way? Foregrounding of a pattern depends on two things: contrast and consistency. Let's take a look at the first: contrast. Now, this is the poem and the analysis that Hassan did that impressed me. Let's see if it impresses you. The poem is written by an Australian poet, Les Murray. The title of the poem is The Widower in the Country. I'm going to read it to you. I don't have, I looked and I tried to find Les Murray reading the poem. That would have been ideal, but I'll have to read it for you. Follow along if you would, please. I'll get up soon, leave my bed unmade. I'll go outside and split off kindling wood from the yellow box log that lies beside the gate, and the sun will be high, for I get up late now. I'll drive my axe in the log and come back in with my arm full of wood and pause to look across the Christmas paddocks aching in the heat, the windless trees, the nettles in the yard. Then I'll go in, boil water, and make tea. This afternoon I'll stand out on the hill and watch my house away below, and how the roof reflects the sun and makes my eyes water and close on bright web visions smeared on the dark of my thoughts to dance and fade away. Then the sun will move on and I will simply watch or work or sleep, and evening will draw in. Coming on dark, I'll go home, light the lamp, eat my corned beef supper sitting there at the head of the table. I'll go to bed. Last night I thought I dreamed. But when I woke, the screaming was only a possum skiing down the iron roof on little moonlit claws. Okay, what's the point of the poem? In terms of verbalization, in terms of what you see, It's a poem about a widower. He's lost his wife. He's alone. And what we see is really rather boring, routine, sort of very described in very mundane terms what he does. Is it art? Is there a theme here? What is it? Can the grammar give us an insight into what makes this art? Now I'm going to come back to a point that I will be making, and that is when we talk about how we construe the world. You remember when I looked at Donald Jung and Susan Rice, and I broke it down into doing and sensing and relating, right? And I broke it down into different process types. Those process types: material, doing; mental, sensing; verbal, saying; behavioral, existential, relational. All right. And corresponding to each process type, there would be different roles. So you have, in a doing process, you have the actor that carries out, initiates the process. You have the affected. You have in a mental process, you have the sensor, who's doing the sensing and knowing and seeing and feeling. And what they see and what they feel is the phenomena, and so on. Now, Hassan breaks it down into, sort of generalizes here. So you have the initiator and the ER roles as opposed to the ED roles. The ER is the actor, the sensor, the sayer, the behavior, the ER role, okay? And you have the affected, the ED roles. All right, so taking this idea, let's look at the poem. I'm looking at the top row, the ER roles, mean the initiators, the who's the actor, who's the sensor, who's the behavior, who's the carrier, and I'm looking at who are the participants here in this poem. Now, obviously, you have the widower. You have that possum. You have some objects, the yellow box log. You have time in the sense of the sun, the evening. And you do have an event, screaming. All right, so these are your sort of participants. Potentially, they could be the actor, the sensor, the behavior, the carrier. All right? Now, let's do a bit of counting. The widower, 28 times is mentioned as the actor, the sensor, the behavior. Most of it is the widower, right? You do have other mentions that other than the widower. So what we could say is that the widower is the background. The widower is mostly in the ER role, but you do have other things that are mentioned, so that where you have other than the widower, that is foregrounded. Likewise, in terms of the process types, 27 mentions of verbs, 27 are of doing. One time of sensing, one behavioral, 3 relational. So what's the background? The background is the doing process, the material processes. That is what occurs most frequently. other than material processes. Those we could say are foregrounded. A contrast is being established between, largely it's about doing, but you do have other things mentioned. All right, come back to logical. I said before that's how you sort of expand from one clause to the next, and whether you have dependent clauses and how are the clauses combined. What we notice is that certain of these sentences, punctuated as sentences, they combine parataxis, they combine this, and you notice that you and then repeat it, right? But you have some that are rather complex. They have a not just and or and then. You have others that involve parataxis and hypotaxis, like when, a dependent clause, and embedding. In other words, you have some that are embedded clauses, rank shifted. The clause becomes part of the larger noun phrase. So you notice that there are some rather repeated, simple connection between clauses, but you do have some sentences which involve all three: parataxis, hypotaxis, embedding, all within the same sentence. That is very much related to the next point, and that is about the use of conjunctions. The conjunction that is used most frequently is and. So and then would be considered the background, and what would be foregrounded would be conjunctions like for and or and but. Tense. If you take a look at it, you can see this on the screen. You have future, I'll get up, I'll leave, I'll go, split off, will be, I'll drive, come back, pause, I'll. Largely well, obviously, as you can see here, what is the background? What is repeated? Where's the consistency? It's future. You do have some present tense. You notice you have past at the end, and you have some non-finite, so no indication of tense, the to look, the ing verb, aching, and so on. And so what we'd say is that where is there foregrounding in terms of tense? The contrast is future is sort of established as the background, and everything else then would be foregrounded. All right, so let's come back. Let's sum it up. We're going to call this transitivity. Halliday, this comes from Halliday's way his theory, and his theory talks about the choice of process and participant and circumstance, and he talks about under the heading of what he calls transitivity. Okay, now don't worry about that. What that relates to is the like process type and participants, material, doing, in contrast with other process types. The widower as doer in contrast with other participants. Repetition of the conjunction and sets a background of simple parataxis in contrast with the complex clauses which combine parataxis, hypotaxis, and rank shifting. Future tense in contrast with other tenses. The widower as theme. Now, theme here is used in the Hallidayan sense, the beginning of a clause. I, in contrast with other theme choices. Well, those are the elements of contrast, where we see established a sort of consistency against which there is introduced something that goes against that consistency, foregrounding against the background. But we've said that foregrounding is not just in terms of contrast. It also involves an element of consistency. What is that meant by that? Now, Professor David Butt, Macquarie University. He says this: consistency of choices weaves what he calls the poem's existential fabric. Consistency of choices weaves this existential fabric. Now let's take a look. Now I've highlighted in the poem on the side. You can see where is the consistent foregrounding. What Hassan did was she looked at where is their foregrounding in terms of the logical, in terms of process or transitivity, in terms of theme. What she observed was that there are certain points in this poem where not only is the contrast in terms of process type, whether it's a doing as opposed to another kind, or the doer is the widower, but you also see that coincides with other foregrounding. The foregrounding itself is what's consistent. There's a consistency of contrast at certain points in the poem. Now, where does that occur? Where do we observe? And in each of these stanzas, we observe that there is a point at which all of the foregrounding occurs together. All those contrasts come alive. With my arm full of wood, and pause to look across the Christmas paddocks, aching in the heat. The roof reflects the sun and makes my eyes water and close. Your eyes water and close. What are you doing? It's tears. On bright web visions smeared on the dark of my thoughts to dance and fade away. Darkness. And then especially that last bit. Last night I thought I dreamed, but when I woke, the screaming was only a possum skiing down the iron roof on little moonlit claws. It was in his sleep. He heard a screaming. When he wakes, he assigns that to this possum. What or who was screaming? Do you see that what the poet has done is draw your attention to the pain, the darkness, the screaming? Focusing your attention, and how is that being done? That is being done by choices that you have no idea. As you listen to that poem, as you read that poem, you don't know that you are being drawn to focus your attention on where the poet is trying to take you in a direction. And what is that direction? That this widower, his grief, it's not just his mundane routine life. It's the pain he feels. It's the darkness in his thoughts. It's the screaming. Hassan says this. She says, Les Murray's Widower in the Country poignantly points to its theme concerning the essence of humanity. To be human, to be an individual, you need to be with others. What makes human existence sane, what protects it from nightmarish chimeras and others' company. What's the theme? What's the hypothesis? Need for others. Let's take a different poem. Road Not Taken. You've probably heard it before. Let's listen to it.
Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference.
Okay, so that's the poem, and that's the poet reading it. What's the theme? What's the hypothesis?
Now, another addition to our NewsHour bookshelf. We look at a new take on a long-admired American poem. Arts correspondent Jeffrey Brown has that.
Two roads diverged in a yellowed wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler, long I stood. The first lines of one of the best-known American poems by one of the nation's best-loved poets, Robert Frost. It's called The Road Not Taken, and that's the title of a new book that calls it the poem everyone loves and almost everyone gets wrong. Author David Orr is poetry columnist for the New York Times Book Review and joins us now. Welcome to you. So it's read as a kind of pay on to individualism.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why you see it in so many graduation speeches. That's why you see it in commercials. I mean, there's no company in the world that would put the poem up as part of their commercial if they knew what the poem is more likely to mean.
Which is what?
Which is what? And notice the title of this guy's book is the poem that everyone gets wrong. In other words, he knows, but we all get it wrong. Okay, now, what we're saying is that a poet comes up with a particular hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. And based on our, now, we would say that based on our linguistic analysis, we can identify the contrast, the consistency, the foregrounding, which we believe points us in the direction of what is the theme, to use Hassan's word, that has been symbolically articulated in the poem. Now, the point being is there one meaning? All what we're doing is, what we're saying is that the artist has some hypothesis. The artist has some message in mind, something that the artist is this extended metaphor. But unlike the expert that you just heard from, what I believe is that what we're really making and what we're really concluding is a hypothesis of our own, a hypothesis about the artist hypothesis. We're trying to use language in a way that gives us some idea as to how we believe the artist is pointing us in what direction. And it's in the language, it's in the grammar, that's what we're saying. But all that we're really coming up with is, and when we said the theme or the hypothesis of the widower, the Les Murray's poem, that is our hypothesis. So let's get that straight from the start. We're not saying that we're coming up with a definitive answer to what a particular poem means. That's not the point. What we're suggesting is that we believe that the language points us in a direction. And on that basis, we make our own hypothesis about what we believe is the hypothesis, the theme that is being put forward. by the poet. Hassan says this about Frost, The Road Not Taken. She said, read with an understanding of its deepest message will leave an impression of the theme, the immutability of human choice. Made lightly because through the thick curtain of the present, it appeared less than momentous, the realization comes too late that the lightly made choice has made all the difference. How does she come to this conclusion? Now that's what we're going to take a look at. It's, again, we're to the point where we should be taking a break. So we'll take a break here and we will resume again top of the hour, at which point we will take a look at how Ruqayya Hassan looked at this poem. She never published a paper about this particular poem. She had notes that when she passed away, the notes were discovered about her analysis of this poem, and that's what I'll be talking about when we come back at the next hour, and that'll be at 2 o'clock. Okay, so let's take a break and see you soon. May I remind you about the Introduce Yourself survey. Now, a number of you have done it, but a number of you have not. Please do so. It is helpful to me. We haven't yet, and maybe we will later on in the semester, but for now we haven't met face to face, and I don't see you, and the interaction. I would like to know a bit about who I'm teaching, who I'm lecturing to. And so I hope that you just take a brief time to complete that Introduce Yourself survey. It would help me to know better sort of what your background is, what your interests are, and what you're hoping to get out of this course. All right, so please be sure to do that. And another thing is, please also be sure to check out the announcements. All right, so that you will, for example, get the video link and also any other information that I want to pass along. Sometimes I get emails and questions which I realize then the person has not looked at the announcements. So please do follow the announcements and keep track of what's going on with the course. All right, so that's just a brief thing to remind you. All right, so come back to this. We're looking at Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken, and what is his, if this is an extended metaphor, what is the metaphor, and what is the meaning of the poem? Again, we are suggesting a hypothesis about the writer's hypothesis. All right, so we come back to how we are approaching this. We're approaching it through the grammar. What does that mean? That means that, well, in order to get an idea as to what is meaning, we have to look at what's the wording. And the wording is the grammar, and that's the combination of words, all right? That's what we mean by the grammar. And so we ask questions like, what kind of processes are taking place? Who initiated the process? What are the circumstances? Remember what we just saw in terms of looking at the widower, that poem. We looked at tense, we looked at the logical, we looked at the experiential, that we call, Halliday called it the transitivity. Those choices that were being made. All right, so again, in approaching this poem, we will do so in terms of similar method approach that we're taking. Again, we come back to the process types. This is what Halliday calls transitivity, all right? The system of transitivity, choice of process, how you represent it as doing or sensing or saying, and who is in the ER role, who is in the ED role. Now, on top of this though, we can look at it in a bit more delicate way. The process types, can we distinguish these processes, some as being more dynamic than others? Might we say that, for example, the actor carrying out a goal like Tom kicked the ball is more dynamic than to say that Tom is tall? Well, that describes something that's not very dynamic. He's tall, that's his attribute, all right? So we can see that there is sort of a climb, a continuum between more dynamic and less dynamic. Now, some of these occur in the poem. We're not going to look at all of these, all right? Explain all of these, but we do see some of these occurring within the poem. Like an actor with a goal, an actor as the medium in terms of an intransitive process, a single participant. That would be like if I said the door opened. That would be an example. The two roads diverged. That is actor as medium. A sayer, but not said to anyone. The sensor, one who senses something, and an attribute, like Tom is tall. We can see that probably pretty clearly with these. And then this is how it sort of lays out within the poem. We can see those involving two roads diverged, that's actor as medium. We can see looked as a sort of a sensing process. To keep, to take, these would be more actors involved in a process. Now, what can we identify from that? Let's again break it down into sort of a table in which we take a look at the ER role. And here we're going to look at just the first person, I. All right, so what do we notice about I as the actor? Twice we have the verb to take, keep, censor, knowing, doubting, a mental perception, behavioral, look, sayer, telling. Now, one of the points that Hassan makes from this is that the non-dynamic nature of the protagonist, I, first person. The only dynamic action that the protagonist makes is taking the road. That's it, the choice to take that road. That's the only really dynamic action that the first person takes. What about the road? Well, again, what do we conclude from that? The road themselves, they have no effect. They simply are. They are not a medium. They are not the agent, all right? They don't have a very dynamic role. So what she says is this: the universe that is being set up by this poem is one in which a dynamic role does not appear to be assigned either the I of the poem or the roads. Both appear equally incapable of affecting the world around them. So let's take the last category, other. And what we notice here is something interesting, and that is that the others who have worn down this this pathway, all right, and their steps on having trod on this road. Notice that these two acts are carried out by what? I can't say who. More, it's a what. And notice that they are, first of all, anonymous. We have no idea who the people were that wore down this path. In fact, it is simply said as the passing. Notice that we are using also basically a kind of grammatical metaphor. We aren't talking about actually wearing it down with the passing. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them. So it isn't actually what has worn down the road, the passing. Not people, the passing. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trod in black. No step. So in other words, what we begin to see in terms of the dynamic role is something that we can conclude. The environment is influenced by anonymous, faceless beings. The only real effectual thing here is the anonymous, timeless passing, the steps. The only effectual thing. Not I, not the road, but the anonymous, timeless passing of steps. Now, think about the logical structure of that poem. When we talk about logical, we're talking about whether the clauses that are expanding on one another are expanding, whether the expansion of those clauses is sort of symmetrical. John enjoys reading and he likes swimming. That's parataxis. And we noticed a lot of that in the widower, all right? Hypotaxis, this is my father who is teaching here. So the who is teaching here is a dependent clause elaborating on something about this is my father, the main clause. We could call it the alpha clause. And we can show this sort of schematically by showing an arc that points from the dependent beta clause to the main clause, the alpha clause. Now, just to get a feel for how the logical structure is important, I'm going to illustrate. I'm going to go off the poem for a moment. I'm going to come back to it, don't worry. But I want to illustrate the importance of the logical, all right? And I'm going to use Obama's victory speech as an example. This is from the last sentence of his victory speech. I want you to notice how important the logical structuring, the connections between clauses is to how something is said.
This is our chance to answer that call. This is our moment. This is our time to put our people back to work and open doors of opportunity for our kids, to restore prosperity and promote the cause of peace, to reclaim the American dream and reaffirm that fundamental truth that out of many we are one, that while we breathe, we hope, and where we are met with cynicism and doubt and those who tell us that we can't, we will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. Thank you. God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
All right, now notice you have three pairs there, all right? At the beginning, this is our moment, this is our time. This is our time to put our people back to work and open doors of opportunity for our kids, to restore prosperity and promote the cause of peace, to reclaim the American dream. We have three pairs there, and notice how it proceeds. So that you have this sort of 1, 2, 3, and then you have another sort of triplet as well, that out of many we are one, that while we breathe we hope, and on and on. So you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The logical structuring of this speech gives it almost a musical kind of rhythm, tempo, so that as he's speaking, you'll notice he gets louder, he gets faster, because what's driving it is, and what is creating that logical, was creating that rhythm was creating that sort of way in which it's coming across to us, as I said, almost with the beats, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, almost in that sense musical. And that is the logical structuring, the pairing of items. Now, again, I'm going to go back to one of Obama's speeches. This was very early on. This was before he became president. He was competing at the time with Hillary Clinton to be the nominee for the Democratic Party. And this was a speech that he gave, and it's considered probably to be one of his best. It's called the Yes We Can speech. And it was even set to music. Again, it's the last sentence. Notice that last sentence, how complex it looks. But there is a pattern to it. And the patterning involves the logical relations between clauses.
We know the battle ahead will be long, but always remember that no matter what obstacles stand in our way, nothing can stand in the way of the power of millions of voices calling for change. We have been told we cannot do this by a chorus of cynics, and they will only grow louder and more dissonant in the weeks and months to come. We've been asked to pause for a reality check. We've been warned against offering the people of this nation false hope. But in the unlikely story that is America, there has never been anything false about hope. For when we have faced down impossible odds, when we've been told we're not ready, or that we shouldn't try, or that we can't, generations of Americans have responded with a simple creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. It was a creed written into the founding documents that declared the destiny of a nation. Yes, we can. It was whispered by slaves and abolitionists as they blazed the trail toward freedom. Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
It was sung
by immigrants as they struck out the shores, pioneers, pushed westward against an unforgiving wilderness. Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
It was the call of workers organized, women who reached for the ballots, a president who chose the moon as our new frontier,
And the king who took us to the mountaintop,
and
pointed the way to the promised land.
Yes, we can to justice and equality. Yes, we can to opportunity and prosperity. Yes, we can heal this nation. Yes, we can repair this world. Yes, we can. And so tomorrow, as we take the campaign south and west, as we learn that the struggles of the textile workers in Spartanburg are not so different than the plight of the dishwasher in Las Vegas, that the hopes of the little girl who goes to the crumbling school in Dillon are the same as the dreams of the boy who learns on the streets of L.A.
We will remember that there's something happening in America.
That we are not as divided as our politics suggest. That we are one people. We are one nation. And together we will begin the next great chapter in the American story with 3 words that will ring from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea. Yes, we can. Yes, We can. Yes, we can. Thank you, New Hampshire. Thank you.
Right now, look at that last sentence. How come it can sort of be set to music? Because again, there's a patterning here as we take, as we learn a pair, that the struggles, that the hopes, a pair. We will, 47G, 47M, together we will pair. And then we have that there is something, that we are not as divided as our politics suggests, and so on. So if we look at it, and again, if we sort of map it out, we see that sort of paratactic pairing as we take, as we learn. And then as we learn, that the struggles, that the hopes, we have another pair. Now, all of this is sort of preceding, hypotactically, sort of the dependent clauses to the main clause. Again, a pair. We will remember. We will begin. And what will we remember? That there is something, that we are not as divided, that we are one people, that we are one nation. Do you see the triplets and the pairs and all of these, this patterning, all of it is crafted together in such a way as to give it that musicality that makes it comes across to us as not just eloquent, but the patterning itself has a rhythm that drives and makes it seem to be quite powerful. Now come back to the poet. Again, the logical is figuring very importantly. Now, the logical structuring here, what we're talking about is grammar. The part of the craft, part of what is being done here, again, is creating a particular patterning. Now, notice. Now, I'm adopting here because Hassan did not finish her analysis. She only finished the first she broke it down into two halves. In the first half, she identified as having sort of three parts. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. And the next part, and sorry, I could not travel both. And then a third part. So one half of it breaks down into the three parts. Then I looked at the other half. And this one is even easier to see because it's punctuated in that way to break it up. I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads to way, I doubted if I should ever come back, full stop. And then the last sentence. You have you have two halves. You have each of those halves divided up into three parts. Very symmetrical, very even. But notice the whole point of it is two roads. Balanced. Which to take? Interestingly, if you look at the end of the poem, two roads diverged in a wood, and that goes back to the beginning of the poem. I took the one. That goes back to the second. That goes back to the third part of the first half. There are two alternatives presenting themselves. These two alternatives, the attributes of the two roads, there is no choice but to choose. But there is no real basis for the choice. One road, the other road, both roads equally lay. There is no basis of choosing one or the other. And the choice is based on just the simple facts of the existence of two. The choice taken blocks out the other choice. The consequence of this forced choice, though, are everlasting. I shall be telling this. What's this? 2 rows, indistinguishable. Taking of one without any real justification. 2 roads diverged in a wood. I took the one less traveled by, and that. This process of creating, that choosing, that taking that road, the only real dynamic mention for the first person, I, the only real dynamic action here in this poem is taking, making that choice. And that has made all the difference. So she comes to this conclusion based on what she's been looking at in terms of the language. What does she say? Will leave an impression of the theme, the immutability of human choice. No, she's not saying you cannot see it another way. She's just saying that when she looks at the language, this is what the language, the direction that the poet seems to be taking the reader in looking at that poem. A literary artifact is an extended metaphor. The whole poem itself is a metaphor for what it is talking about. All right, let's take something more current. I don't know if you've ever watched America's Got Talent, but America's Got Talent, there's an auditions phase at the beginning. And well, in America's Got Talent, who are the usual winners? They may be singers, they may be dancers, gymnasts, performers. But this past year, there was a spoken word performer.
Hi.
How are you? What is your name?
My name is Brandon Leak.
Hi, Brandon Leak. And where are you from, Brandon?
I am from a small little city called Stockton, California.
Stockton, California. And what do you do for a living?
For a living, I work at a high school and a college, but I also run poetry workshops with youth in my city.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Wow. So poetry, is that what you're going to be doing tonight?
Yes, I'm actually the first spoken word artist that you guys are ever going to have hit this stage. So I'm super excited to bring poetry to y'all.
Tell me, because I don't really understand poetry, I'm going to be honest with you.
I'm a great intro for you. I bring more about life experience, things that everyday people go through.
And where could this lead to if you did well on the show, Brandon?
Well, I have like a huge aspiration of being able to put on my own large production one-man show.
Okay. So tonight's poem, is it something you wrote?
Oh, I only perform stuff that I write, never be able to perform anything else.
And what is it? What is this one about?
So tonight's poem is actually an ode to my sister.
Are you close to your sister?
Very much. She's here with me now.
Oh, she's backstage?
Kind of.
Well, we already love you. Make us love your poem.
Beautiful. I got you for that.
Okay, so that was the introduction. Obviously, you don't get spoken word performers on America's Got Talent. I mean, who comes out and basically has a poem? Tell you the end, all right? He won America's Got Talent. He actually won. Now, this is just at the beginning. This is the audition phase. We'll come to his spoken word performance in a moment, but this is the response after his audition.
Wow.
It is a wow.
Flowers across the sea, memories are what they used to be.
You're tearing up.
My brother passed away the same year that your sister passed away.
Man.
Yeah, I can feel your pain. I know what this is. I know what it is to have somebody taken from you without you knowing. But it was very beautiful for me.
Thank you.
What an amazing tribute. There's something very, very special about you.
Thank you.
Really. This is a very difficult thing for me to judge. I shouldn't be judging it. I just want to compliment you on what you just did because it was extraordinary.
Thank you so much.
Really?
So much.
Well, it's amazing to me that on season 15, it's the first time that we're hearing somebody of spoken word. There was something more raw in the way it's like singing and talking and just being a human a cappella. No music, no nothing, just a raw heart beating in front of us. We feel your pain, we feel your love, and you moved me to do this.
They speak of a better place. They speak of kingdoms and how they come. They speak of freedom and marching drums. Freedom and marching drums.
You're amazing, buddy.
That was the response. Now that golden buzzer at the end, basically that means a free pass to the live shows. And he went through several stages to the live shows and ended up, as I said, winning America's Got Talent. Now, the point is, this is what Halliday says, in real life, texts carry value. We need to explain that value in terms of what we know about semiosis, about meaning and how meaning is made. Texts carry value. That spoken word performance, that carried value. That was responded to, we know that, on the basis of wow, and then the applause, and then the golden buzzer. And finally, yes, in fact, winning America's Got Talent. Not just with that performance, but subsequent performances and so forth. Now, that, we have to go back. We have to say that we need to explain that value. Again, it's still part of what we've been talking about, because we've been talking about the artist's craft. And here's the spoken word performers. How is he using language to make meaning, and not just make meaning in the sense of what is said, but in terms of how it was responded to. Now I'm going to sort of map out this performance in sort of the same kind of thing. You know, this would be the clauses themselves and how they're sort of, are they paratactic? Are they dependent? Let's take a look at this. This is the performance, sentences 1 through 4.
I have 2 facts for you. 1, I'm 6 feet tall. And 2, love is the most vulnerable thing one will ever have. And you must learn to hold on to it loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully.
What can we say about it? It's rather simple clauses. I have 2 facts for you. I'm 6 feet tall. And so that you have those sort of paratactic joinings, and that is sort of typical of spoken word. Rhyme loosely, painfully. Continue. Sentences 5 through 8.
On July 14th, 1996, an angel was brought to this earth. Her name, Danielle Marie Gibson, but I only know her as Puff. Her smile is as wide as the universe. Her eyes, they glimmer like the stars. She is my world.
Okay, again.
And my sister.
Simple clause structure. Rhyme. Sentences 9 through 10.
I, just 4 years old at the time, learned what it meant to love selflessly, for on days in which my strength was but knee-high, seeing her smiling face would make my soul fly. But
Again, rhyme. We do have some embedding here and so forth. But again, we basically see sort of quite a simple, straightforward clause structure here. But then it breaks, but. And that but sort of draws a line between what we have heard so far and what is yet to come. When I take a look at this beginning part 1 through 10, up to that but. Now, what I notice here is that, like sentence 1, 2, simple clauses. 3 involves some embedding. 4 and 5, some simple, in this case, combination of clauses. And then 6, 7, 8, again, simple, some embedding in 9 and so forth. The clause structure, as I pointed out, has been pretty simple. I've spoken like. And you'll notice the rhyme, loosely, painfully, universe, stars, high, fly. And so we have a simple clause structure, and we have the rhyme. And now we come to what follows after that, but.
On March 23rd, 1997, I've been ground bound because she left Earth to go back home amongst the stars right next to God, but I was left here to manufacture wings out of tears and broken dreams, yet I'm still haunted by these nightmares because I have a really creative mind. And sometimes it designs these alternate realities where she is still here, still alive, and all the things I wish we could have done are played again and again and again. And I'm tired of playing God because I got to come to terms with the fact that my sister ain't never coming back.
All right, now, notice something. What I've done is I've looked at the number of content words per sentence. And as you can see, as we're going along, they're about quite level. But on 13, it really climbs. It stands out. Why does it stand out like that? Why do we have that number of content words? Because in that sentence 13, you have a number of clauses all making up that sentence. And you'll notice the one that's where, it's also, he says it, his voice has the emotion. And it comes and it peaks here at that point. Now, if we take a look at 13, and we notice we have a number and. So it's compacting a lot of information here. We have cause. Now that is very spoken colloquial like, right? Instead of because, cause. So we have a sentence here which stands out compared to the previous sentences for as being very much more, what should I say, expansive. And thus the larger number of words, but also at this point, it's where his emotion comes across. 14 and 15.
And that's the cost of love. Caring for someone so much that you can't imagine living life without them. Staring at a grave like, how about I trade my 6 feet for yours, but that's not real. And I know I said earlier to hold on to love loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. But if this pain and these memories are all that I got left of you, I won't never regret these scars from just trying to hold on to you.
Now, if we look at this spoken word performance, you'll notice that how it begins is very similar to how it ends. At the beginning, we have this repetition of the verbs to hold on, leaves, won't exit, We have it at the beginning, we have it at the end. We have repeated mention of being 6 feet tall, and the use of rhyme is at the beginning and at the end. When it comes to 11, we have that, but we also notice that there's a shift from active to passive. Been groundbound, was left, haunted. He is no longer, he is the affected. He is not the initiator. We notice the frequency of conjunctions, especially from 11 onwards. We notice two buts, a pair of buts here. One which splits the text at that point from the first 10 sentences and sentence 11 onward. She left. That's active. And 12, but he was left. He is no longer the initiator. He is the affected. We've mentioned 13. We've noticed that, and we notice the increased use of hypotaxis instead of parataxis in what follows in 14 and 15. So some observations about this spoken word performance. We notice the presence versus the absence of rhyme. We have presence of rhyme at the beginning, and then it is absent from 11 through 14, only returns at the end. We have simple versus complex clauses. The first 10 sentences are quite simple compared to from 11 onwards, more complex. We have parataxis in 1 through 12, and the hypotaxis is much more pronounced in 13 through 15. And we have an elevated lexical density in 13 through 15, but especially sentence 13. What is the theme? What is the hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man? The poem comes full circle. But when it comes full circle, the simplicity of the beginning is left with a complexity at the end. The rhyme begins it, the rhyme ends it. We have the same kind of phrasings at the beginning and at the end. The poem comes, he's come full circle through the trauma of his sister's loss. But he comes to a different outlook on life and loss by thinking grammatically. How much can we learn about how a text comes to mean what it does? Now that's the point that I've been trying to make with you today in terms of looking at poetry, spoken word performance. What moves us? What moves us is there is something happening in language. And what is happening in language, we can only really describe by looking at how the words are combined, the wording, the grammar. You know, I'm going to be looking at next week with you a poet, the Singaporean poet Edwin Tumboon. I've analyzed his poetry, and one time after analyzing his poetry and coming back to him, I wrote up a journal paper and I asked him to read it and asked for his comment. And I said, did I get at what you were doing? And his response was, some of it. Some of it. We never really get at the totality of what it is that the artist is doing. But if we can get grasp some aspects of what is happening here through language that creates the response that won over a public to give the America's Got Talent award to this spoken word performer. What is there about his performance? What is there that moves us in Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken? What is there that moves us in The Widower? What meaning are we getting out of it? What is the theme? And the language is giving us an idea. It's giving us some insight. As I said, next week, we're going to take a look at the artistry, the poetry of this Singaporean poet. His name is Edwin Thumboo, and I said to you before, he's called the father of English language poetry in Singapore. Edwin Thumboo. He's visited Hong Kong and visited City U, and in fact, School of Creative Media had a special exhibition related to his work. It was called Edwin Thumboo Naddison, The Infinite Line, and they even did a performance of it in Shanghai. So what is Edwin Thumboo and his poetry? If you've ever been to Singapore, you've probably seen the Merlion. In front of the Merlion, there's a plaque. And on that plaque is a poem. And that poem is Ulysses by the Merlion. It's written by Edwin Thumboo. What Edwin Thumboo says is, I'm looking at language as part of my life. I'm trying to make my poems, putting language together. Technique is all about poetry and the making, the chiseling of language, the rearranging of language, the sound, the rhythm, the tautness, the layering. So next week we'll begin with this poem, Gods Can Die. After looking at Ruqayya Hassan's look at her study of the widower, Les Murray's poem, I was prompted to take this poetry written by Edwin Thumboo, and this poem, the first one that I analyzed, Gods Can Die. So we'll come back to this. It's time is close, and I don't want to start this when we've only got about 5 minutes left. So I'll stop here. And again, let me remind you, please fill out that introduce yourself survey form. Please complete that. And then I'll see you next week. If you have any questions, you can ask me on chat or you can email me later. All right, so I'll say goodbye. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, Professor. Before we go, is there a textbook that we have for this course?
Sorry, my speaker on my computer is not working so well. I think that I just heard something, but I can't quite make it out.
I'm sorry, Mr.
If you could, do we have a textbook for the course? Is that the question? No specific textbook. As I mentioned in the first lecture, I have written a book called On Verbal Art, and that will be quite useful if you were interested in following up. But no particular textbook per se, and I will be giving you some readings over the course of the semester, but I will not be asking you to necessarily buy my book or another textbook. All right. And I will give you, for example, I will tell you if there are some readings that I give you, they will be coinciding with the lecture. For now, there's no specific reading that I've given you, and next as I post readings for you, then you'll be able to go through it. Okay. So, okay, thank you, bye-bye, and see you next week.